Labour's first year in government ended with a backbench rebellion, a chancellor in tears, and Jeremy Corbyn announcing the launch of a new political party. Elsewhere, Reform suspended one of its 5 MPs. Ed Davey finally criticised the BBC's sycophancy towards Nigel Farage's party. And Downtown in Business hosted its annual City of Liverpool Business Awards. Welcome to the 100th edition, yes, the 100th episode of the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
So it's great to be joined by my 2 regular partners in crime. Joe Phillips. I nearly called you something else then, Joe. Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. And can you believe 100 episodes, James? We would never have made them, of course, had you and I simply stuck to the duo that we were when we first kicked this podcast off. It's only because of the expertise and insight knowledge that we've received from Joe that has maintained us and seen us get through to our century. So thank you very much, Ms. Phillips. How are we? We had a good week?
Yes, not too bad. I'm slightly putting my head in my hands at the state of the government and thinking, for goodness sake, what is going on with these people? And for people who haven't read your blog, I think you made your views very clear, with which I heartily agree, although Jim thinks I'm just creeping to you.
Well, I think that creeping is allowed, particularly when it's worthy creeping. And I thought it was an excellent blog as well, Joe. James, what about yourself? You had a good weekend. Have you been to Wimbledon yet?
Not Wimbledon yet, no, but I followed up a most enjoyable evening in the Palm House in Sefton Park with you, Frank, by a trip to Silverstone on Saturday. Well, I'm sorry, just before that, on Friday, I was in Manchester at the Central Library, where they are putting on a little bit of a display to the history of Piccadilly Radio. And they're also digitalizing a large number of programs, including, and I know you two will find it difficult to believe, some of mine, so that for perpetuity, in a million years' time, when the earth is a husk and they come and find what's left, they'll hear a recording of me interviewing Winston Churchill, the MP for Davey in 1985. But it was nice to get back with the old Piccadilly Radio crowd, Mike Sweeney and Phil Wood, people that people might remember, and then on Sunday it was Silverstone.
Very
for
good.
Lando Norris's victory, and of course the heavens opened. I mean, my son perversely likes it when it's wet because it means they're changing the tyres all the time. But it was thunder and lightning.
Very, very frightening.
Yeah, it was very inclement, was it not, at Silverstone? For my part, I went to the Lytham Festival on Saturday evening to see Justin Timberlake, who was outstanding in terms of his performance. But the highlight of the night for me was bumping into Everton's manager, David Moyes. So that was very nice. And of course, David lives in that neck of the woods, so he was at the festival probably on a freebie. But yeah, a good weekend had by all then. So a better weekend, I suspect, than that was enjoyed by the Prime Minister and his Chancellor after what was a torrid week, where, of course, on Friday they celebrated, if I can use that word, its 1-year anniversary in government. And last week we talked about the trials, the tribulations, some of the successes as well within that first 12 months. James gave them 5 out of 10 for the year. I gave them 6 out of 10. Joe gave them 7 out of 10. But of course, this was all before the rebellion took further hold of the government in terms of its planned welfare reforms, and they decided to overturn the whole package. So 0 savings were made. In fact, it's anticipated that the changes that are now going to be presented will cost the government money. And in addition to that, Prime Minister's questions, remarkable to see the Chancellor break down in tears. Now, she is claiming that it's for a personal matter, and who are we to say otherwise? But coming on the back of that damaging defeat on Tuesday and some of the briefings against her, particularly from backbench MPs, it's hard to believe that there was no political implication in terms of her mood at Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. So, James, I'm going to kick off with you. What did you make of, as I say, what was a pretty awful week for Labour as it came to that first year anniversary milestone?
Well, obviously, it was distinctly unfortunate the milestone came up just at the time of this most spectacular U-turn. It really was the spectacle of a government on the run from its parliamentary party. One has to put it down to a lack of communication. I mean, I'm told the chief whip of the Labour Party is held in high regard, but somehow, I mean, this didn't happen overnight, and there should have been a gauge of this level of opposition much earlier, when the government could have nuanced its approach to it rather than doing it spectacularly, firstly before our podcast last week, and then with Stephen Timms making a further U-turn which completely removed PIPs and any reference in the bill. And I believe they're having to change the long title of the bill now because it doesn't refer to PIPs. So, you know, very difficult, raising huge questions, two huge questions. One, is Labour going to be capable of reforming the welfare system, which is in desperate need of reform? I mean, the stories that are coming out about what's going on in the welfare system, these people who've set up as PIP consultants telling people how to get through the thicket of it. I mean, ordinary people who go out to work and don't claim benefits are going to start to get more and more angry, and that's unfortunate, because there are people in need. We must always keep this in mind. There are people in desperate need who need the state's support. But, you know, there's a danger that in the reaction to this, the whole welfare system is going to be under attack. And, you know, as I said, there is doubts about whether the government are going to be able to do anything about reform. And it looks as if the first casualty, but not, I think, according to our views on this podcast, will be a bad news story, is that the two-child benefit is going to stay. You know, Bridget Phillipson was hinting at that over the weekend. So, you know, somehow the money has got to be found. But, you know, it's the authority of the Prime Minister, the feeling that something else comes up, he can be pushed in a particular direction. And it's pretty serious. And, you know, I think, as I'm going to say in my blog this week, I think the government, to quote a prominent Northwest political figure, have got about 1 year to keep people listening.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think they have got another 12 months to try and turn things around. I mean, just sticking with the welfare question for a second, and we will get on to Rachel Reeves and how upset she was in the Commons and what we made of that. But in terms of the reforms themselves, what I found most distasteful, in a sense, was not just the wrong-headedness of the approach those Labour backbenchers took, because they were not offering any alternatives to the savings that are required if we are to survive as a country, because you just can't simply continue to have this ballooning welfare bill in terms of where we are economically. But it was the carry on out of some of them afterwards. It's like, we've won, it's a victory. Who do they think is in government? It's their government that they've just basically defeated and blown a bloody big hole in their fiscal plans for the future. And the other thing that I found totally naive, this was from a number of left-wing MPs, I have to say, was this idea that, you know, we've got 1 in 4 of our constituents who claim these benefits. Well, I just remind them, the point Jim's just made, you know, 4 in 5 people don't claim those benefits, are getting heartily pissed off with some of the scams that we are increasingly learning about. And it's not just the scams either. I have to say, the whole approach to PIPs and benefits now seems to me to need a genuine radical shake-up. And perhaps the mistake that the government made actually was just not going far enough and being radical and bold enough. So let me just give you an example. People who are on PIP and mobility, not necessarily saying this is 100% of people, but certainly some people, are entitled to go and get themselves cars, like 30 grand cars. Now, this is just incredible to me. I remember my old dad was on the old mobility allowance, and I think he used to get, he was like 70, my dad at this point, and I think he used to get 100 quid a month towards a car. And so he had a little Ford runaround, which was perfectly fine. That's all my 70-year-old dad needed. You've now got people going out and getting themselves Audis and throwing 100 quid at it because the rest of it is paid for by us, the taxpayer. So if Labour MPs think, oh, we best not upset those 1 in 5 people who are claiming benefits, Joe, I'd suggest to them they start to need to worry about the 4 in 5 who don't claim benefits, and as I say, are seeing this sometimes abuse, sometimes scamming, but always, in my view now, this over-generous benefit system that's been put in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And this sense of entitlement.
Yes.
Which is, of course, we have a welfare state, and that is quite right for the reasons that we all know and accept and applaud, to support and help people, either throughout their lives or at periods in their lives when they need it, whatever that might be. I think Jim's right too. I mean, the whole thing went tits up because of the lack of communication. It was always sold as a thing to save money, instead of, actually, this is a better deal for working people, you're 4 in 5. It's about reform. So it means no more phone interviews. You've got to turn up in person. You'll be assessed, and it will be regularly assessed. If you talk about reform, then it's much harder for people to rebel against that. But if you talk about cuts, it's just the same as the winter fuel. And of course, we've got the other one looming right now on the horizon, which is the special educational needs. So you've already got hundreds of disability and groups and charities and parents, understandably anxious and worried about their kids. But it is unsustainable for children to be ferried from, home to school by taxis backwards and forwards at a huge cost to local authorities to go to a special school. Now, if you're talking about reform, which Bridget Phillipson has tried to, she's talking about putting that specialist service in mainstream schools. But unless you change the conversation, the Labour Party is just going to destroy itself, just like the Tories did. And they're not helping anybody by doing that. It's really shocking. It's naive. And they might as well have scrapped the whole thing and gone back to the drawing board. I think the problem is, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but what I have heard is they did not consult with the people who are doing the job, the frontline staff, the people, who actually are dealing with people on PIP. And they'll make the same mistake again on the education reforms if they don't talk to the people involved.
Well, what do you make of this co-author? This is a rather new word in politics, but I don't know what you guys think about it. That to avoid this happening, they're going to try and co-author the welfare reforms. But
I mean, that was fairly popular about sort of 15, 20 years ago. And actually, Steve Reed, who's now the Environment Secretary, introduced it at Lambeth Council when he was the leader there, Lambeth in London, which was this idea of a cooperative council, that everything should be done as a co-production, co-authoring and all the rest of it. I mean, the thing is,
I wouldn't be against it, Joe and Frank, if I thought it was going to produce some results. But unfortunately, across the table are going to be one set of people who probably don't want any change. If they're welfare organisations, are they going to? Maybe they will be broad-minded enough to realise what Frank's saying, and the economy is going to hell in a handcart, and bring a liberal mind to the conversations. But it could just be an entrenched, we don't want change, and the government saying we must have it.
But that's the point, Jim. If you bring people together, you say, okay, what is your alternative? Because it's only when you do that, as you both know, when you do that sort of community engagement, particularly on things like planning, nobody wants the bus stop moved, but everybody wants a park, and you've got to say to people, well, what is your red line? Where's the give and take? And you have to, I think, tell the story. 4 out of 5 people are not claiming PIP.
But I think the point that we made for months and months now almost since day one of the government, is the lack of narrative, the lack of story. And it seems to me that when you read those, long written profiles of the Prime Minister, and there were 3 of them last weekend, and I've managed to catch up with all of them now. And then you read the book that is sat on my shelf there somewhere, Get In. And Keir Starmer almost words with pride this idea that he's got no ideology. And I think that's a problem.
It is a problem.
Because actually, if you've got no ideology, then people can quite happily wander into the House of Commons as a new elected MP and think, well, Keir believes with what I think, which is no austerity, no welfare cuts, rinse the rich, all those things that the soft left and the left think are natural Labour Party positions, because Keir Starmer's not told them any different. And I thought last weekend we would see perhaps a shift in his narrative to say, well, I might not have an ideology that's called Starmerism, but these are the clear things that I want to achieve, and this is the vision that I have. And if it is about fairness to working people, then actually that does mean reform of the welfare system. But it means some urgency around that. It needs urgency around planning reforms, which is going through the Commons at a snail's pace at the moment, to the point where this government ain't going to see any benefits in that. They may take all the pain, but they're not going to get any of the gain. And similarly, with, as you've pointed out, Joe, the education system. I thought Bridget Phillipson spelt out her objectives and aspirations quite clearly over the weekend, actually, in saying, no, we don't want to abandon kids with special educational needs, but equally, there are some kids who probably shouldn't be in that category, and it's costing too much anyway, so we've got to get it back into mainstream education. That, to me, Jim, is the big problem, though, that this government has. It's not got an ideology, it's not got a vision. And if it's going to get to that point, as you say, in 12 months' time, where we're having a different conversation, then it's going to have to bloody well find one soon.
Yes, very, very interesting observation you've made there. I think you can almost sum it up by saying that he's a sort of blank canvas upon which any backbencher can paint whatever they want to do, and that leads to confusion and lack of leadership and obviously disastrous messaging. I mean, you're right about the snail's pace of things. I mean, I was wondering what had happened to the planning legislation. You've obviously done some research on it, and I mean, on a much narrower but very, very important for people in the Northwest is the Hillsborough Law. Yeah. I mean, what is, this further delay is just causing disastrous, mistrust in the government. I mean, as I understand it, the sticking point is this question of having equal parity in making legal representations, because, of course, that's always the situation, that the establishment have much more access to legal resources than the poor plaintiffs, whether they be blood victims or people who've got relatives at Hillsborough or anybody else. But I mean, the fact that he made a very specific pledge in Liverpool at the party conference to get on with it by the spring, and it's not happened. So there does seem to be, with this sort of majority and so on, I can't understand what the delay is in these things. Well, that's what I wanted to say about that. I mean, we can talk about Rachel Reeves in a minute, aren't we?
Yeah, let's move on to her now, because, again, I've never quite seen any scenes that match that in terms of the dramatic effect. We've seen prime ministers, we've seen chancellors before that have been performing under pressure and put under some significant difficulty at whether it be a question time or resignations pending and all that sort of stuff. But obviously, we've never seen a chancellor quite literally in tears before. And the initial reaction of anyone who's human, which obviously omits Kemi Badenoch from this particular aspect of the conversation, your heart went out to her. And she was clearly in distress. And she was in distress, by the way, before Keir Starmer apparently didn't back her to keep the job as Chancellor. I don't think that had anything to do at all with the tears, because as soon as she sat down, before a question had been asked, you could see that she wasn't herself.
No,
and Joe, it was just an incredible sight to see, wasn't it?
Yeah, and you know, as you say, anybody who's human, your heart goes out to them. And I actually would say that Stephen Flynn, the leader of the SNP at Westminster, what a fantastic contrast to Kemi Badenoch, who probably couldn't even spell empathy, but who actually just said, you know, to see somebody, another human in distress. But of course, had she not turned up, you know, she was absolutely, if she hadn't turned up, they'd go, oh, well, she's frightened, she's losing her job and all the rest of it. We don't know. We don't need to know. It's none of our business if it's personal. You know, it might make some people realise that she's human, you know, might not be a bad thing overall. But it just added to the sort of chaotic scenes and a feeling that, blimey, they've only been in power for a year. And they have achieved some things, as you read out last week, Frank, but there's things that should be really basic, really simple, really straightforward, and make a difference to working people. They're stumbling at the first hurdle.
Ironically, sorry, Joe, I think ironically, the tears probably were bad news for the Labour Party, for sure, because it just basically encapsulated almost in that one moment the trials and tribulations that we discussed at length last week during that first year. But it strengthened her position because, of course, the markets took an absolute tumble because they thought, wow, she might be on her way out. And then subsequently, Starmer has felt the need the next day to promise her the Chancellor's job for the next 25 years or for however long she wants it, which, you know, you see this is the problem with this government at the moment. They take one particular route and then decide, oh, this ain't the right way to go. And then they throw the bloody baby out with the bathwater. It's all over the place. So from Wednesday, when, okay, it may not have been a case of him not saying Rachel's job is safe, but he certainly wasn't in the lane to suggest, yeah, I've got absolutely 110% confidence in this woman to continue in the job, to the 24 hours later saying, oh, she's in the job forever. But both as bad a look as each other, in my opinion. How can you say a year in, this Chancellor's going to be with me for the next 4 years? Nobody can give people in politics a job for that length of time. Nobody knows what's around the corner. And for me, Jim, this, as I say, is an encapsulation almost of what is wrong with this government.
Yes, I mean, Keir Starmer, I mean, we don't get too much into the weeds of all this, but where they were sitting on the front bench, he couldn't see her. But nevertheless, as soon as Kemi Badenoch, who incidentally could see her and has been criticised for kicking a woman when she was down, but he should take every opportunity when his chancellor's under attack to express his support for her, whether he could see her or not. I mean, I think that whatever the private matter is, that's not a matter for anyone. I mean, I understand that, you know, and you can imagine this, that when this revolt was building, you know, it was the Chancellor who was having to say in her office, as more and more demands came to unravel it, well, where's the money coming from? You know, I put this budget together very carefully. Where's the money coming from? There were a lot of shouting matches there. I think also apparently Lindsay Hoyle, the speaker, has a problem with the length of Rachel's answers, and as she came past the speaker's chair already pretty upset, I think he said, you know, keep it, you know, remember what I've said or something. And so there was all that explanation. But you know, you have made a good point that, of course, you know, she's almost bomb-proof at the moment because of what Keir Starmer's had to say. I mean, it's just one final point, of course, the welfare people haven't got anywhere to go. I mean, the Conservatives actually want bigger welfare cuts, and Reform UK, I don't know what they want, but I can't imagine that they want to leave the situation as it is now. So, you know, I think the government have now got to, I mean, I would say that get on with this co-authored work during the summer and come to the party conference. I mean, this bill is just going to limp along. Come to the party conference with a strategy and then really get on with it in the next session of Parliament. That's what my suggestion would be.
I'm really against this co-authored nonsense, because I think what you're just going to end up with is the same mealy-mouthed approach that we've suffered from in the first 12 months. I think Starmer, Reeves and the rest of the front bench need to come to conference in September and lay it out to the people of the country and to the Labour Party and to those trade unions who, and we'll come to this in a second, may be having a flirtation or two to their further left in terms of this new political party that's on the horizon. So if I was Keir Starmer, I'd be looking at this job now and saying, I've got one chance. The silver bullet now is to go for big, bold, radical reforms. I ain't coming for £5 billion from the welfare budget. I'm coming for 25 billion. I ain't going to start messing about with NHS workers who are going on strike. We're going to start tackling these things. And if we need to spend more money in the private sector with private health services, then we're going to have to do it. He's got to start taking people on, because otherwise, Jim, we are going to be sat here in 12 months' time. And I see you smiling because I know.
No, I'm just thinking of 1976 when Dennis Healey went to the conference and said, I've just come from the IMF. You can pass all the resolutions you like here, but I know what I've got to do. It was a massive bust-up, Frank.
But I tell you, Jim, right, we are not in the stage yet where Rachel Reeves is having to go to the IMF. But if we continue to just simply borrow, change the fiscal rules, put tax up. And I read something a couple of days back, which surprised me, actually. But if she puts a penny on income tax, which will kill them politically, right? They're finished if they do that. They put any of those three taxes up that they said in the manifesto they wouldn't. They are dead. They could have done it at the start of the Parliament. Too late to do that now. It raises her £6 billion. So it only covers the cost of that welfare bill that she's trying to get down. By 2030, you would have to increase income tax or another tax by another couple of pence. And already the Treasury are warning Rachel Reeves and the government that the tax increases that they've made so far are actually going to lead to a lesser tax take this year because of the implications of those tax rises. Okay, some billionaires leaving the country, not a lot of them. More depressingly, bosses having to lay people off and make redundancies, or worse, go bust themselves. So for a whole range of reasons, this idea that there's a bag of money waiting for you only if you put taxes up. So for me, Jim, I understand the comparison you're making with 1976, but they are not at that point yet. They are still a government who've got a huge majority, which of course Callaghan's government didn't have in 1976. And I think you've just got to lay it out and say to them, we're not living in fairy dairy land, we're living in the real world. And if you don't bite the bullet on these changes that are required, then good luck to you, because what's coming next is either reform, or if it gets its act together, a Conservative Party, which will cut far deeper than this and will have permission to do so.
Well, it would be a welcome return to a party conference actually being a party conference, because, you know, since Blair's time and even before, but principally since Blair time, the party conference, the Labour Party conference, and the others as well, not the Liberal Democrats, by the way, who wonderfully go through every policy line and vote on it, and it's very democratic. But for the Conservatives and Labour, it's just become a... Well, all right, well, she can give us the inside story. I mean, yes, well, okay, yeah, I know what she's going to say. You know, yeah, we have student fees and we pass everything, every bit of policy on that, and then, of course, we renege on it. But, well, she can wound herself. But, I mean, for the Conservative and Labour Party, the conference has become a money-making enterprise, and very good for the Liverpool economy, as we were chatting about last week, Frank, with our friends in Sefton Park. But it has not been what they've tried to avoid is really debating the contentious issues in front of a television audience. Now, all I'm saying is, you know, it may be a time to lay down the law to actually tell the reality.
But it conference, and by the way, I certainly wouldn't be having a debate about it. I'd just be making the statement and saying this is where we're going. I wouldn't be letting every left-wing lunatic stand up on the stage and your dirty washing in public. That's an absolute mess. This is why the Conservatives have been in charge for as long as they have, because they manage their politics properly. And when they're in government, they know how to handle and manage themselves. And this is the problem, Joe. You've got all these new Labour MPs wandering into the House of Commons, go, oh, this is terrible. I've got 20 emails in my inbox of people saying this is the wrong thing. Fucking hell, I better vote against that and rebel. Well, guess what? Carry on doing that. And in 4 years' time, you won't be getting any emails from any of your constituents because you're going to be on the dole.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think they've got to use the summer recess to really, really focus and just crack on with what do they want to do? You know, they can't, we've had a year of blaming the Tories. We all know the Tories were crap. You don't need to say that anymore. Everybody knows that. Everybody who's working in the public sector, everybody who's, involved in finance, they need to really push on. They need to act like they are leading and running a country, and not as though they're frightened local councillors. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, because I think local councillors are bloody good, but this sort of, well, let's see what these people think. Yes, by all means, get people together, get input, say to people, all right, you don't like it, what are you going to do? And then I think, you move on from there. But you see already there are now whisperings and briefings against the new head of the civil service, Chris Wormold, with people going, oh, that seemed like a bad mistake. Well, hang on a minute. Well, first of all, it was Sue Gray. Then it was, what's his name?
Simon Case has gone.
Or Simon Case. Then it's Morgan McSweeney. Now it's this Chris Wormold who apparently wrings his hands. What you've got in the shape of Keir Starmer, and by all accounts, the head of the civil service, and up until last Wednesday, Rachel Reeve, you've got people who are so wet. As one Tory MP once said about one of his colleagues, so wet you could shoot snipe off him. But it's just, come on, get some backbone, decide what you're there for, because it's not, we are not shareholders in something, and it's not long before it starts eating. And we can't do what the Democrats did in America and just wait for reform or the Conservatives to implode. Meanwhile, people need to see their lives improving.
Show some leadership, and let's see where they go in year two. But I do think they need a radical shift in terms of the direction they've taken and the way in which they've gone about governing the country so far. And some of the things they've done, and we listed them last week. This isn't a Labour bashing podcast by any stretch of the imagination. We went to great lengths to explain some of the good things that have happened, but they haven't been big, they haven't been bold, haven't been noticed by most of the electors, which is why they've lost 10% of the support since last July, and why Reform are ahead in the polls at this moment in time. And I guess partly why Jeremy Corbyn, former Labour Party leader, who was of course expelled from Labour about 18 months, 2 years ago now, I guess, has decided to set his own party up along with a very able former Labour backbencher now, Sarah Sultana. So what did we make of that, Jim? Not a surprise in some respects, but more importantly, I suppose the question I should put to you is, what effect do you think that will have in terms of Labour's support?
Well, we more in common, I think, have already done a poll, and it's 10. They would get, the Corbyn party would get 10% in the opinion polls, and of course the importance of that is we're now in this very fragmented state where knocking 10% off the Labour vote could be quite serious, because they
all that 10% wouldn't come from Labour though, Jim.
No, it would come from the Greens as well. That's the other place.
Yes, I did notice that. That's true. That's true.
But still, it's still, listen, Labour can't afford another 1% off its support at the moment. So the point you make is still well made.
Yes, I mean, I think we just need to wait for the formal announcement of this party. I mean, apparently she did go ahead without full agreement with Jeremy Corbyn, and some people are saying that despite his socialism and desire for equality, he'd quite like to be the unambiguous leader, that he hasn't quite grasped the idea of dual leadership of this sort of thing. So let's see what happens. one of two things can happen. It can become just a sad irrelevance for a politician who has made a contribution to British politics, but leaving the Labour Party will be difficult for Jeremy Corbyn, and how effective it will be, what policies it will have, we'll wait and see, and it could all just implode. But there is something that does cross my mind, which is that there is a lot of talk at the moment about, I don't know how to put it, but a party being formed around the interest of Muslim people in this country, and particularly, obviously, by what the ghastly things that are happening in Gaza at the moment. And one can see an affinity, because obviously Jeremy Corbyn and Sarah Sultana are both very exercised by the Gaza situation, and so bringing those two together, if that's what it is, that is a more formidable challenge, and indeed a challenge to British politics, because it's in danger of bringing in a sort of sectarianism, which we don't really want to see. So this has the potential to be either just an ultra left irrelevance, the People's Liberation Front, or the Liberation Front for the People, and all that sort of stuff, and just a sort of factional thing on the far left with the Communist Party of Great Britain and the Communist Party of England, Marxist Leninist. We know the list. It could be like that, but it could, and the circumstances I just was talking about, be an important factor in a sort of a hung election where all the parties, none of them are commanding about up to 30% in the polls. That's the point.
Now, very fractious party system, multi-party system, as Joe referred to last week. I think what those people would say to you, Jim, in terms of suggesting that the establishment of a party that was pro-Palestinian would create something that was a little less, a little more toxic than the one we've got. They'd say to you, well, Reform have already done that, in terms of dividing the nation in terms of black and white, and Reform would argue against that, but some people would say that's already happened. The thing that struck me when I read about this, my views on Jeremy Corbyn, very well known. I thought he was a disaster before he became leader of the party, even worse when he was leader. And, he'd gone into the wilderness to an extent. I think, again, if you look at the politics of this, which is where Keir Starmer and his advisors ought to have been looking, they should never have taken the Labour Party membership card off the guy. They should have given him a bit of a kicking for his lack of reaction to the anti-Semitism report, but he'd served as penance, he'd done his suspension. He was always likely to win that Islington seat when you look at the polling numbers, and then just become a bit of an irritant and an outrider in Parliament as an MP for his last year in the Commons. I bet he didn't really fancy running against the Labour Party. I don't think he'd have ever left of his own accord. All that being said, Joe, I do wonder whether this may actually help Labour in the longer term, because the loonies have got somewhere to go. And again, Corbyn could be saying, as Max Sweeney was apparently in the run-up to that revolt, well, let 50 of them go. There's bloody 50 of them here who we just need to get rid of anyway, because they're not really Labour MPs.
Yes, I think that is absolutely true, but I think there would be quite a lot of people. I mean, there is a huge argument. I sit in a constituency where only 3 months after the election, our MP resigned the Labour whip and now sits as an independent and refused point blank to have a by-election, and local people are really pissed off about it. Not least of all, the people who worked from the local Labour Party, leafleting, campaigning and fundraising. So I think there are several things here. One is, I think Jeremy Corbyn is a busted flush. But if he wants to set up his own party, that's fine. There's George Galloway probably come back and help him, and, Zara Sultana. Well, actually, if she wants to resign the whip and, all that stuff, well, okay, stand for a by-election. I know there's an argument against it because of the cost and stuff, but actually, if you're really committed, then stand and see whether the people in your constituency want you to be there, because most of them will have voted for you because you're a Labour MP. I mean, I do think there are questions, and I know this would probably be misconstrued by the likes of the Daily Mail and everybody else, but I do think there is now an absolutely incontrovertible argument for PR because our politics are so fragmented. And I think if you lower the voting age, you introduce PR, but you actually really make sure that there is proper information, that it's part of the school curriculum, you begin to have a more educated electorate, and you get people involved.
The only other thing
can I just say on
sorry.
this point, Jim, that Reform have already got 18 and 19-year-olds running council budgets, looking after social care and public services.
So you should be allowed to vote at 16.
There is an answer to that, but I don't want to be distracted. Just to make one point, it is interesting that at the moment people are very angry and frustrated, and so far they seem to be going to the right. I mean, they don't seem to have it, because another way of being frustrated about things is to say, yes, let's take the commanding heights of capitalism, let's cut our defence budget, let's tax the rich. I mean, I imagine that Corbyn will have an agenda of that sort, but it's not the way that people are going. They seem to be going more to the further right.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, before we close the first part of today's podcast, the other point I would make to some of our trade union brethren who've demonstrated some excitement about this new move from JC and said, well, maybe we should be looking at moving some of our funds behind this new left-wing political party. I would remind them they have to consult with their membership. And my thinking around this is that if they were to offer the option of which political party they should be funding, whether it be Labour or the loony left Corbyn party, or Reform, then Nigel's party might get a few bob more from trade union members than those trade union leaders would appreciate. So just be careful in terms of where you're going to put your affiliation fees and how much of an issue you want to make from that, because if there's 30% of people in this country saying they're going to support Reform, then you can bet your bottom dollar that a significant chunk of them are trade union members. On that note, we will end the first part of today's podcast. We'll be back to talk about Reform, talk about Ed Davey finally sharpening his elbows, as we've been asking him to do for a while now. And we'll be taking a brief look back at what was a fabulous night, celebrating some of the best in the business in Liverpool. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of our 100th episode of the Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, joined as ever by Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. And we've been talking about Labour's inauspicious year in office. This new insurgent right-wing party called Reform has taken a poll lead. It's running at around 30% support across national polls and has been for some months now. But let's look back at its first year in office. It started off with 5 MPs, went back to 4, it went back up to 5 when it won a by-election at Runcorn. It's now back down to 4 because a guy called James McMurdoch, who'd already found himself caught up in previous controversies over alleged domestic violence, has resigned the whip himself pending an investigation into business propriety. So Reform does seem to be able to get away with these sort of scandals and misdemeanors because, alongside this, there's been an awful lot of allegations, rumour and more in terms of councillors who've been elected. Joe has already referred in the first part of the programme to an 18-year-old who now finds himself leading a big county council with the Reform badge on. Nigel Farage, I think it was demonstrated last week, takes more freebies than every other member of Parliament, I think almost collectively. And yet they continue to sail through in terms of the polling. And as I say, they're running at 30% at the moment. I haven't even mentioned the chairman resigning and then reinstated himself back into the party 48 hours later. Jim, this particular issue seems to me, because it's a Sunday Times Insight investigation, I believe, relating to loans that were taken out by Mr. McMurdoch during the pandemic. So government-backed loans, and then the two companies that the loans were taken out for have allegedly never filed a tax return and have both subsequently gone bust. So maybe the last we see of Mr. McMurdoch. But on a serious note, and I've listed all those things that you could point at reform failing on, a bit like Trump in the States, Farage just seems to be able to shake these things off, doesn't he?
Yes, I mean, there is, I mean, I imagine the Reform UK, the new chair of Reform UK, and all his sort of staff are one of the first things that they must do to create a serious party is to improve their vetting of candidates, because this man was obviously elected to Parliament, last year when their vetting procedures were very poor. So that's why this particular chap has got through. I mean, the only thing to say is, if we're reviewing all the party's performances in the last 12 months, with all these difficulties with Rupert Lowe and the chairman resigning and coming back and so on, I mean, I think Sir Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch would rather say that they would rather be in Farage's position 12 months on than in their own position, because
That's the point I'm making, Jim. Why does he get away with it, do you think?
Because he's representing anger and frustration with the British people that they threw out a Conservative government who they didn't have confidence in, and was mired in confusion, only to elect a Labour government which hasn't made the progress that they expect. I think it's unreasonable, actually. I think the electorate are impatient and all that sort of thing, but never attack the voters. And they're saying, oh well, this the new lot are just as bad as the old lot. Let's find something else. And Nigel Farage, with his charismatic personality, and I know that you're going to bring this up again, his high media profile, which is helped, of course, by the GB News and having his own shows and all that sort of thing, which is another matter we can discuss. In fact, we ought to discuss that more than whether the BBC should have him on, whether he should be having his own programmes. And it's a product of all that exposure, charismatic character, failure of the other parties. That's why he is where he is.
Combination of the three. Somebody who we've admitted, haven't we, on many occasions, definitely knows how to work the press and knows what a soundbite looks like. But the other thing he's taken to doing, Joe, is out of the Trump playbook again. When a journalist asks him a difficult question, this was the point that Jim was making last week, well, it gives you an opportunity to scrutinise them. Of course it doesn't, because they do what Trump does. Oh, that's nonsense. I'm not talking about James McMurdoch. That's got nothing to do with me. The vetting process wasn't right at the time, but I'm not dealing with those matters. Do you want to interview me over serious matters or not? And he walks off. And he gets away with it, because there is no way in the world that that Keir Starmer, that Kemi Badenoch, that Ed Davey would be able to get away with that with our media, and yet Farage does.
Yeah, well, it is all of the reasons that you've said. I mean, and he is up against, not very much competition. He speaks human. He looks as though he's got energy. And the other thing that he does, which is also, Trumpism, if you like, is this shooting crap. You come up with an idea, it might be absolute cobblers, but you've put it out there so people are talking about it. Even if they then go, well, actually, that's total rubbish, they've moved on to something else. I mean, interestingly, he's just been in Kent visiting the new reform-led county council here, and has said in an interview, well, I wasn't in charge of vetting before the election last year. It wasn't anything to do with me, Gov. Which to a certain extent is true, because he only decided to stand as an MP, just before the deadline to do it. So, but in a way, so what are you doing? Are you dissing your previous leader, Richard Tice, or you're dissing your colleagues, or, but you can do that. But it's also a weakness. I mean, Jim may have a different view, but it is a weakness of journalism, where actually when people ask the question and he says, well, I don't want to talk about that, you do need to have the gumption to say, well, actually, I do want to talk about it. And actually, you might say you weren't there in charge of vetting of candidates up to the election last year, but what can you say about how you're reassuring people now? I mean, there are many ways to press somebody, and nobody does.
Well, you have to have the freedom that Jeremy Paxman had. I know it's often ridiculed and so on, but to ask the Home Secretary Michael Howard 14 times whether he threatened to sack Derek Lewis, and you've got to have a long form programme, and you've got to have the support of your editors to actually do that, and then drill down to it. Whether it would have any success, because I would like to see Farage really pressed on how he intends to fund the National Health Service, because he does brush off this business. Oh no, we're not committed to an insurance policy anymore. Well, what are you committed to? And to really press him on that. But it needs a combination of the right program format, support of an editorial, but then I still wonder if he was reduced to a gibbering wreck, whether it would actually make any difference. But
I think part of it's that sort of star quality, that he turns up, and because there are these adoring crowds around him and people wanting selfies, it's quite hard, as you and I know, Jim, to be the person that's going to burst that bubble and say, hang on a minute, I want to ask you about X, Y, Z.
Don't do it there. That would have to be in a proper television studio, not when he's got his crowd around him. No. I mean, I was once in a position where I was trying to debate with a controversial former politician in Liverpool, and all his friends were surrounding me, and it was almost impossible for me to make my points. But that was
they weren't his friends before Jim started interviewing, and by the end of the interview, they all thought he was great. But that was more to do with Jim's poor preparation for the interview than it was.
There's a Protect Jim Hancock following to this podcast, don't you, Frank? They think we bully him.
I get accosted every single week, getting told that we bully James. But then there's an awful lot of people who have said to me, "You're absolutely right on the BBC and Reform." And the person who absolutely agrees with me is Davey, Joe. So tell us a bit more about the interview he did on The Guardian, and also subsequently put on his Twitter feed as well that he thought the BBC needed to really look at itself when it comes to the coverage it was given to a party with, is it 4 or 5 MPs? I think it's 4 again.
Yeah, might be. Could be 4. Could be 3 by now. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ed Davey did his sort of 1 year on from the election with The Guardian's Peter Walker, and reflecting on for the Lib Dems. I mean, 72 MPs is fantastic. Huge number of councillors. They're gaining people and they're gaining seats. They won a seat from Reform in Durham in a council by-election last week. Their membership is steady, but they are getting nowhere near the coverage that number of MPs would warrant. But what it does give, it gives Ed the chance to get called at Prime Minister's questions automatically. And it does mean that there are more MPs, more Lib Dem MPs on the very influential select committees. But he made the point, as you have, almost word for word. In fact, I think he may be a listener to this podcast, because he could have taken those words right out of your mouth, to paraphrase Meatloaf, and said, why is he on the BBC so much? Why, when they've only got 4 MPs, 5 MPs, and the BBC's answer, as I've mentioned before, when people write in and complain, which is what I say to people, don't tell me, write in and complain. They go, oh, well, they got 4 million votes. That actually is really neither here nor there, because you either have to say, well, an awful lot of people didn't vote, so let's not cover politics at all because they didn't vote, or let's work it out on a proportional basis according to the number of, which is, it's a rough measure, but it's a reasonable measure, but it does not reflect, the Lib Dems, and it doesn't reflect the Greens either, who went from, Caroline Lucas, the one and only Green MP, and they quintupled their number of MPs. And you sort of think, come on, I don't know. Well, I think the BBC have got many, many questions to answer, and there is, there's an awful lot of angst going on about the roles of the people who are sitting on the board, who were appointed by the previous Tory government. The Robbie Gibbs links to Jewish Chronicle and things like that. And I think the BBC, and the nonsense about Glastonbury. They really do need to think about it. But, you know, unless people complain, nothing will happen.
Yeah, well, I think people are complaining. And I think that the message is starting to hopefully get through to the people at the BBC. I'm not suggesting that reform shouldn't have a platform, and we all understand and appreciate, as we've said, that Farage is, from political terms, a bit of a star, and particularly at the moment where politics does lack personality. But I always go back to this point of there are flagship programmes that the BBC should basically have a big ring around that says, if you are a minor party, then you get on this once a year and make sure you take your chance, because we ain't going to give you a regular platform on this. I think the wider role that Jim was referring to earlier, Ofcom, should also be scrutinised by Lisa Nandy, who is the Minister for Department of Culture, Media and Sport, because how MPs, even to an extent, MPs who are still clearly active within their political parties, have been allowed to host programmes on GB News, just baffles me. Doesn't in any way, shape or form measure up against what the restrictions used to be. And you'll know this more than I, Jim, but I hosted a programme on City Talk, 6 years, business programme, and then went back onto the district council for a short stint for 4 years. And they quite rightly said to me, well, if you're going to do that, Frank, you're not going to be able to present your programme. And that was fine. I understood and appreciated why. That wasn't that long ago. So has the legislation changed, James, or have Ofcom just got a bit frit in terms of challenging these new channels, these emerging news companies?
I think I don't think the laws change, but I think with the sprouting up of these multiple channels and what's happened in the United States is slightly influenced Ofcom. I mean, they can't be on programs actually during election campaigns themselves, but that's really missing the more general point. No, I don't know. I mean, do we want to go as far as saying that elected MPs cannot present programs? It's most probably, local councillors. Would you extend it to them? I don't know.
Well, that's what I was, and I wasn't allowed to. Yeah, I mean, I think there has been a relaxation since then, because I think I'm right in saying that before the election, David Lammy used to present something on LBC.
Yeah.
So I think the rules must have changed or been relaxed in some way. Nevertheless, the idea that we're talking about a party political leader here, not even a backbench, relatively obscure personality who's presenting his own programme on a weekly basis on GB.
This isn't just respect. I mean, a friend of mine was listening to Azarika, who's, I think, a peer in the House of Lords, asking her audience, what questions would you like me to ask in the House of Lords?
Yeah, she's on Times Radio. I know. I mean, I think it is, and I will declare an interest again. I mean, I appear on Nigel Farages' programme regularly. In fact, I'm on it tomorrow as the resident loony lefty, which is, fine. I don't mind that role. They hate me, but there you go. But I do think, the Ofcom rules are very, very opaque, that they say MPs cannot present news programmes, but they can present news discussion programmes. Now, if the channel is called XY News, you would suggest that they're doing news programme. It's not about fly fishing, is it? And you sort of, I don't know, I think it's sailing close to the wind. And Ofcom will only react if there are complaints.
Yeah,
they're not
and if the government's stepping.
Yeah, but for the government to step in, they get involved in the free speech row. Ofcom will only butt in if people say, hang on a minute, this is ridiculous. And that sort of needs to come from other political parties as well. I can't remember the last time I heard an SNP voice or a Plaid Cymru voice or a Green voice on GB News. They get the occasional Labour person and a few Tories and previous Tories. But it is difficult to see how you can do that not just once a week, but 3 times a week.
Yeah. Well, good on Ed Davey for sharpening his elbows and having a little kick at the
Exactly.
BBC. But the problem is wider. And again, this comes back, doesn't it, to what we were referring to in the first part of the programme, and Labour being slow to react to things. So during that relatively short honeymoon period that they enjoyed, had they come out then and said, second jobs for MPs, gone. Farage is stuffed. My guess is at that point he'd have said, you know what, my mate Donald's just getting re-elected to the White House. I'm resigning as MP for wherever it is, Croydon, and I'm off to work in the States, because he couldn't afford the pay cut. But the second jobs thing, again,
well,
where is that?
They said
Where
they
is
were
it?
going to ban it, and
Where is it?
It should have come in, as soon as Parliament sat after that election.
Yeah, as I say, these things get more and more difficult, more controversial to do, the longer you're in office. Jim, sorry.
Well, no, I was just saying that one of the complexities is apparently there are 1 or 2 Labour MPs. There's one in South London, Joe will know who I'm talking about, who is actually a practicing GP as well, and it's felt that her knowledge helps with the health debate. Not all of them are rapacious merchant bankers and people swanning around. Some of them actually have useful jobs, but I think that I still think it should be swept away. But that's the hold up, I think.
But you could say, somebody who is working for the health service, or somebody who is a lawyer, maybe.
You could have exemptions, couldn't you?
Of course you could. I mean, the Lib Dem MP who's just introduced a private members bill with all party support on livestock worrying, and strengthening the penalties on that. He's a vet. And actually, you could quite argue that there are people who bring their expertise and their knowledge into the Commons as they do into the House of Lords. But it's the ones who are doing it as a sort of, it's a money-making thing, or it's the sort of, it's a self-promotion.
Yeah, I think something could and should have been done about it, but it's not all the fault of Ofcom. It's not all the fault of the BBC. Partly, as I say, I think the government should have got a grip of this more firmly.
Well, the IPSA, the organisation that regulates MPs, is launching a consultation on what MPs should be paid. So we can all put our views in on that. And the guy was on saying we will have views ranging from they shouldn't be paid anything, which, as he said, takes us back to the 19th century, or that they're getting a reasonable amount of money, or that they should be paid more. So it's quite. I'm not sure this has been open to public discussion before.
Maybe that should be a co-authored paper, and maybe we should say that as part and parcel of the incentive for MPs to start to take a good look at the country's finances seriously, we will put some sort of package together whereby they need to start to contribute to the fiscal gap that we currently have and the debt in this country. I doubt very much whether that'll work, and I've long time felt that MPs aren't paid enough. So there you go. Final thing, let's end on a joyous note, and we celebrated the City of Liverpool Business Awards last Thursday at the superb Sefton Park Palm House. It is a truly spectacular venue. It was the 22nd year which we'd hosted those particular awards, and there were some worthy winners, including Liverpool and Everton football clubs, who picked up awards for their business contribution to the city. Lang O'Rourke, who of course were the developers responsible for that magnificent new stadium on the River Mersey, Joe, which is the home to Everton, of course. And a whole host of other winners as well. But interestingly, we had the leader of Liverpool City Council, Liam Robinson, with us, James, and I know you entertained him for much of the night during dinner and beyond. But it was a great evening, wasn't it? Always a good occasion under that fantastic setting of the Palm House.
Yes, and you paid a gracious tribute to Diego Jota and pointed out that the whole city was united in sorrow at the death of a highly talented footballer. It said so much about, Liverpool, sometimes gets a bad press, but the way in which the city's come together, and the fact that you paid tribute to him and to his brother was another highlight. Yeah, I mean, it was a great night. I mean, it's always best if it's sunny in the early part of the evening, because you start off outside having a glass of something and in the warm evening sunshine, then you go in and then the magic of the night sort of comes in. It's a wonderful venue, and we were and we were well looked after, as you
He's back to
always are.
burlesque, Joe.
What was
Well
in
looked
that
after,
glass?
I think he's talking about the views.
Okay,
As the
I
sun
think-
comes down, and the Sefton Park Farmhouse should
okay.
explain to people is basically it's a giant greenhouse, yeah. So obviously you are absolutely experiencing the way in which the sun goes down, and yeah, it is a spectacular view. James, we enjoyed it, did we not?
Yes, we did, and it was a lot of awards. And I just love it over the years as we see different businesses winning the awards, and we see the sort of the way in which business is developing. You can see newcomers awards, and you begin to see, things moving from manufacturing or that sort of thing to sort of data and IT and all sorts of younger people. There's a good age spread of people there, and it's a really good night. But we generally put on good events. I mean, Joe's been at our Westminster receptions, which are less of jollification, but nevertheless, is that side of downtown, lobbying, making views known, bringing business people together, and having a good time as well. It was a great night.
I do travel north, I have been to events in Liverpool and Manchester as well. I do go beyond the M25, Jim.
I thought you had to take smelling salts when you left Watford.
I'm in Liverpool tomorrow, as it happens.
Yeah, don't forget your passport, and and of course you've been to our conferences before as well.
Exactly.
In Manchester. So yeah, Joe is a seasoned downtown attendee, and we need to get you to our next Liverpool Awards actually in November, which is the Liverpool Awards, and the nominees were announced today. So go onto our website, you'll see the shortlisted candidates, and of course we have the City of Manchester Business Awards taking place in September as well, which this year will be presented once more by the legend that is Lucy Meacock, and that's always a great night at the Lowry Hotel too. So lots of things happening in the world of downtown, our events programme. We hope to see some of you at those events over the next couple of weeks and months. But for now, that is it. It's the end of our 100th episode. We're going to start our next century of podcast episodes with a very special conversation. Tomorrow I will be interviewing Sir Graham Brady, the former chair of the 1922 committee. I think it's right in saying saw in and out of 10 Downing Street more prime ministers than he washed dishes during that particular time, because there was a lot of things happening, and he's got a new book out. It's been out for a number of months now, called Kingmaker, but it's out in paperback form. So we're going to be discussing his book, but we're going to be discussing a lot more besides. And if you get a chance, listen to a podcast panel that Graham was involved with us during the pandemic, when he warned of the consequences of lockdowns, much of which I have to give him credit to say has come to pass in terms of mental health, in terms of operations for cancer and other serious matters being made, and in terms of the damage it was done to the economy. So it'll be interesting to get Graham's thoughts on that. So please do take a listen. And do you know the other thing I meant to mention this week and totally forgot? And we said this had happened during this ridiculous public inquiry into COVID. Matt Hancock made a disastrous contribution to that inquiry this week. Went totally under the radar because of Rachel Reeves' tears.
Yes, I was astonished at the lack of publicity that got, because it was a very tense hearing, and Hancock was very defensive and not answering any of the questions, but that putting people in elderly care homes without testing was one of the gravest misjudgments of that awful period.
Well, I will be picking up on the pandemic and his thoughts at the time. And as I say, I think Graham has been justified in many of the criticisms he made, but I'll be asking him much more, of course, about all those prime ministers that he had to go and tell, your time's up, pal. So listening to that one, and next week, of course, we will be back our usual Monday slot. Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. Have a great week, everyone. Thanks for listening. See you all again soon.